to your latest installment of the Day with Dre podcast. This is yours truly, Dre, and we've got a day full of updates to talk about. And if you're familiar, I ramble a little bit. I talk about what I think is stupid, funny, etc. But you know the drill. So before we get started, make sure you go ahead and like, subscribe, podcast, throw a follow wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Spotify, whether that's Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. If it exists, you can probably find me there. Those are greatly appreciated. It helps me grow my audience, and just always adds a little more encouragement to keep going. All right, let's get to it. So I remember in the last episode, I ended talking about how we needed more love in the world, and it seems like everything's doing quite the opposite. The powers that be are on some sort of revenge tour, and a lot of everyday people are kind of following that same kind of mindset, trying to dunk on people in any way that they can. And I'm not sure how that's bringing us closer together, but whatever. I'm not necessarily moved by it. I'm going to dig down and do me no matter what the powers that be are doing to the best of my ability. But it doesn't seem like a whole lot of greatness is happening. People aren't coming together. There's just a line being drawn, and people are entrenching themselves further and further apart. And we're already losing our minds a little bit. Of course, we're at the end of the first week of the second Trump term, and we already have a representative, Andy Ogles, or however you say his name, out of Tennessee that just put in a bill for Trump to have a third term. So his bill is to allow third terms for presidents, but only if you didn't serve two consecutively. So that way you can get that, Trump can follow this term with his consecutive term. And first of all, that's just like the ultimate dick riding. Secondly, it's crazy because the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, is supposed to be about limited government, do your job, get out. And now they're trying to change the Constitution and allow for expanded presidential terms, because really this just cult-like following for Donald Trump is just, objectively, there's nothing that he did in those first 4 years of presidents that should warrant the following like he has. Like, this is his second term, and at the end, be done with it, like every other president in modern history. It's not like people are arguing for George W. Bush or Barack Obama to come back for a third term. And they certainly, well, maybe not you, but Obama certainly, his fanboys and gals, but no one's arguing for them to come back again. But of course, the first thing you do is you open Pandora's box and people are like, third term? Well, let's bring back Obama. And of course, that's why they had to stipulate that if you had two consecutive terms, you can't run for a third term, because you already know they would, dust off Obama and bring him back out to run against Donald Trump. And let's be honest, he probably kicked Trump's ass because he seems to still be beloved by so many. Whatever. That's just the beginning of some of the insanity. One of the other things that is just ridiculous is everybody's so mad at the bishop. I can't remember her name, but there was a bishop that on this past Tuesday or Wednesday, let's see, I think I might actually just have the recording here, right? True. As the two people listening have immigrant or descendant of immigrant wives that she's addressing. And she's just literally saying, have mercy on those whose children are fearful because of the executive orders that he signed. And the backlash that this person got, and from the president himself and a lot of his followers, for a literal bishop, a Christian, preaching about mercy and, kindness and that is literal Christianity to a T. And there was even one person, that elected official, that suggested that she gets deported with everybody else. And it's just like, what is this? You can't even criticize Trump without people just getting their panties in a bunch. And it's so disappointing, because you have these people that are treating him like a king, not even like a king, they're treating him like God. Honestly, you can't say anything bad about him or even ask a suggestion of him, because I don't think asking for mercy and kindness towards frightened people is saying anything bad about Trump. That's just asking something of him. And you get people that are so outraged on his behalf. And then, of course, we all know how he is. And he also, called her a, extreme leftist or something like that, because that's the stupid shit that he says. It's just so disappointing. And people are eating it up. And that is just, honestly, that's just where we are. That's who we are as a country. Obviously, there's individual people that are like, that's not who I am. But as a country, that's who we are. There's a lot of people that kind of fall into that sort of mob mentality. And, if there's one thing that we do here is we fall into mob mentality. And these are just perfect examples of it. And just some more of the craziness that's going on, like with the whole TikTok stunt. Trump's the first person to talk about banning TikTok, and then TikTok goes down for a day or almost a day. And before he's even the president, they're talking about working with President Trump to bring the app back. And then as he's about to be sworn in, the app starts working again. And of course, the app is completely different because there's a lot more censorship on the app now. And it's just fallen in line with what Meta's done and what Twitter/X has done. And now TikTok as well. Is the censorship is crazy. And we're just, all the stuff that they talk about, or hearing China and all that bullshit about government censorship and government doing this from the party primarily of less government involvement and more freedom. And they're just doing exactly the things they're telling you to be afraid of other countries for doing. And it's so funny how people seem to not be able to see that. And the censorship, it's so ridiculous. Like, for example, on Twitter, someone said something to a black person, like, shut your stupid, big, black-lipped mouth up or something like that. And then the black person responded with, shut up, cracker. And then the shut up, cracker was flagged for hate speech. But, like, big, stupid black lips is apparently not hate speech. Or you can say nigger, and that's not hate speech. But God forbid you say go jump in traffic, cracker, or something like that, which of course is inflammatory language, but it's not only inflammatory in one direction. But that's kind of the direction social media has gone in, and it's unfortunate, but it is what it is, because that's the world we're in right now, and that's what we got to deal with. And I think it's funny that people that complain so much about cancel culture, as people complaining about attempting to be canceled are running the country, and now they're trying to cancel a bishop for being a bishop. It's just funny how that works out. So apparently cancel culture doesn't only go one way, like they try to make it seem. But yeah, so in the first week of Trump's presidency, he's handed out some executive orders, some more interesting than others. I think what's some that caught attention are, of course, like kind of disbanding FEMA and like the IRS and stuff like that. So of course, his friends, he's got all the billionaires of America are all in his pocket. Of course, not all of them, but the richest ones have his backing. And of course, with the IRS down, they're probably just going to figure out ways to make more money, because being worth $400 billion for Elon Musk is not enough. And of course, normal people, they might not make less, but their dollar won't go as far. And without the IRS, although I'm sure, they probably weren't doing anything to rich people in the first place, but now rich people won't even have to try and use tax loopholes, because no one will be monitoring them if the IRS goes away. And with FEMA, the thing that's interesting about FEMA is, if you think about a lot of those states that use it the most, you think about like hurricane states, I'm not sure that leaving their disaster response up to them is probably the best idea, because it just seems like the federal government, your job is to help out your states when they need help. And I think politicizing the response, like, for example, if California doesn't do what we want California to do, then we're not going to help in the response to the wildfires. And these are the same people that want to talk about states' rights and stuff like that. None of it makes any sense. It's all politicized. The executive orders, as far as the economy goes, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on that. I guess we'll just see how that works. Pardoning the Jan 6 people, I don't think that if you were in DC on January 6th, you should be in jail. And that I'm definitely not in that camp. But I think if you went into the Capitol building, you rightfully went to jail. That's not, you got a person that now that this election's been won by Trump, it's fair and square, but the one he lost was stolen. So of course he says that those people should be freed because they were just protesting a crooked election. Those were his words. And that's just, I don't know, that's just Trump. And you got, people that hurt police officers. And I'm definitely not sitting up here as a police officer apologist by any means, but the party of law and order is pro freeing people that completely defied law and order because they defied it to push their agenda. So again, none of these, like the party of law and order is pardoning people that tried to stop the certification of an election and broke into the Capitol building, and multiple police officers died and others were injured, and now these people are being pardoned. Like, just make it make sense, because none of it makes sense. If the conservative party is who they say they are, then you wouldn't be pardoning those people. But it was to push their agenda, so all of a sudden these people are, they're fighting for freedom, and they deserve those pardons. But God forbid a person's undocumented, and do they get even a shred of that same amount of grace? No, they're not breaking any laws. They're not doing crime. They're not doing anything. They're just, working an honest job. And, do they get the same grace? Probably not, but whatever. Also pardoned so there are two police officers that were sentenced for murder and cover-up of, I think it was a DC citizen back in 2020. So these two cops got into a police chase with Karan Brown and resulted in him losing his life. And then they obstructed justice and tried to cover up the evidence. And this was all found through trial. They had their due process. And why would they be pardoned? Why would you pardon people that obstructed law, obstructed justice, but then turn around and try to deport a bunch of people for breaking the law? The people that should be held to the highest extent of the law are the ones that are supposed to enforce it, because they know better than anybody. But that's not how it works here. It doesn't make any sense at all. But then again, if you look at the history of the United States, a lot of stuff doesn't make sense. But how do we get to this point where the right just has this, like, they're swinging with the full force of trying to scale back on and control everything on like a absurd level? And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I guess if you want to talk about, is it the right's really strong or is it just the left's really weak? And I think it's probably a combination of both, because the right's doing really well at getting young people, but the left is also just cannibalizing itself. And if you spend like 5 minutes online, you can see it happening. For example, someone, I guess that's from a more left progressive background, might say something and they'll phrase it in a way, like, for example, you can have a conversation about why walkable cities are important and how walkable cities are good for the economy, it's good for health, and present this really good argument about walkable cities. And then someone will come, and it's usually someone that's on the left. They'll say, you're being ableist because you're talking about walkable cities. What about people that can't walk? You're discriminating, you're doing this, you're doing that. And it's like, come on. You have to live in reality for 1 second, and you're never going to say something that includes all people. That's just never going to work. You shouldn't have to stop and say, how does this statement apply to every single person? But that's what people want. And if you don't do that, then they're automatically just like, you're ableist. If I say, I just want better for us, men, we got to do better, then people are going to be like, oh, you don't think women can do better? And of course, the overwhelming majority of people don't think like that, but the amount of people that do is growing, and it's causing a problem. Because if you think about it in candidates, people will tear down a candidate for having one little thing that they don't like, to the point where they just won't support anybody. And it fractures the left, and it really it rears its ugly head when it's time to go to the polls. And this isn't me trying to say that former Vice President Harris's stance on Gaza was a little thing, because that was a huge thing, right? We're talking about a genocide. But the mindset that I'm talking about is not just about the presidential election. It's about how people deal with each other in society, and it's disgusting. Like, you're not being ableist by talking about a walkable city. You're not being misogynistic if you talk about your 5 favorite artists and they're all men. That's not what misogyny is. Yet people are quick to start throwing out those terms, and it's just like you're turning on each other, and then the people that already don't agree with you are just pointing at you and saying, like, look at those psychos over there. Like, this is what you want to be the future of our country, and it just pushes people farther to the right. So that's just my 2 cents on that. And that, it happens to me all the time. So I think personally I might be a little more of a conservative person, but politically I always vote left, because I can be personally conservative and still support left politics, because I can still personally be conservative under left politics. They're not diminishing my ability to be the way I want to be. And so really one of the issues we're dealing with is there's no tolerance for anybody of different opinions. And of course, there should never be tolerance of opinions that are just downright destructive to other people. But if I say that I don't think the WNBA is as enjoyable as the NBA because there's a difference in athleticism, that doesn't mean that I hate women. I still enjoy the WNBA. I just find the NBA more enjoyable because the athleticism's a little higher. And that's just where we are. And you can't say something like that publicly, because people will turn you into this villain that you're really not. And I think that's the left's issue, is they're so quick to turn on each other, whereas the right just put a person that is a 30+ time felon in the Oval Office. So I don't know, something's got to change. But again, on the tune of all these executive orders and whatnot, the ones that I find most interesting personally, of course, are the ones related to DEI. So I think diversity, equity, and inclusion is extremely important. This is how we try to reduce some of these racial gaps and disparities across all different fields. And obviously some people feel differently about that, because what does the White House's page say? It's ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. So the White House is taking the stance, and so many people actually believe this nonsense that I guess without them straight up saying it, they're basically talking around the point that if you are a white person, or a white man specifically, a white straight man, you are discriminated against for people of color, for women, or whatever, LGBTQ people, just because there are positions where there are people saying we need more people like this because representation matters, and wanting job or business to wanting federal positions to represent the people that they're governing is not discriminating against. They don't take unqualified people and put them in these positions and say, well, it's DEI, but that's what people want you to believe. You see a black pilot and people will just be like, DEI hire. And you're like, no, I'm pretty sure that pilot just also went to a pilot school, and they're qualified to do their job. They wouldn't just put a random person in there and be like, well, you're black, here's the job. I'm a black physician. I went to school to get to where I'm at. I didn't just get it because of DEI. But what I did get from DEI in school was we had classes that were dedicated to understanding disparities in healthcare that do exist because of different socioeconomic reasons. And by saying DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is poisoning our country instead of helping our country, it's ridiculous. Yes, it costs money to have these offices and places, but it's probably worth it when people are learning about the actual disparities that exist in this country. And of course they paused they're defunding and pausing all these programs in federal places of employment and highly suggesting that private businesses do the same thing and they will not be punished for getting rid of DEI offices. And so companies like Amazon, gigantic company, has already taken down DEI initiatives, whereas Costco said that they're going to stand by theirs. And it's just ridiculous that in 2025 we have people that think that they're not getting their jobs or they're stuck where they're at because some Mexican person got a job just for being Mexican, or black person or a woman, they're getting jobs just for being that, and they didn't go to school, they didn't put in the work, they didn't do all of that. So if your company has no women and you have a woman and a man with the same credentials, same training, there's nothing wrong with being like, well, we don't have any women, let's hire women. That there's just nothing wrong with that, because forever being a woman would exclude you from being able to be in those positions. Or the fact that medicine is like 5% black, and so they're like, okay, well, the country is more than 5% black. There are black quality applicants out there. Why are we not getting them in schools? I don't know, maybe something called implicit bias exists. So let's have these offices that are dedicated to how do we fix these problems. I was one of 2 black people in my class, and I think I was the only one that was American born. Not that it really matters, but you get people that see me on the campus and that saw me on the campus, and they'd probably be like, oh, he's only here because he's black. Black people are taking our seats as we're 2% of the student body. But that's the world we live in. And the funny thing is, a lot of the people that benefited from this, veterans also benefit from DEI initiatives, are going to be hurt by it a lot. Probably not the super majority population, but this is going to hurt women, white women. This is going to hurt Asian Americans, South Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous Americans. Of course, it's going to hurt Black Americans, because that's the one people always point at when you hear DEI. They think of Black people. It's going to hurt all people that aren't white dudes, potentially. So we'll see how that plays out in the long run. Oh, and of course, ending birthright citizenship. Good call. Being born in America doesn't mean you're an American anymore if your parents aren't both Americans. So cool. That's supposed to be our thing, but judges are already fighting back against that. So yeah, that's just a big overview of the executive orders that we're kind of dealing with right now. And how long that'll last, I don't know. Like I said, judges are already fighting back against some of them, especially with the birthright citizenship. That's going to be a hot topic, because that is like the whole gist of being American is if you're born in America, you are an American. Other things from the first week of the presidency, obviously Monday was Martin Luther King Day, and President Trump declassified MLK, Robert Kennedy, and JFK's assassination documents, I guess. Probably just kind of a here, have fun with this. Of course, they declassify it, and then they keep a lot of stuff covered up as secret. So it's like, what is the point? If you're going to declassify it, go all out, or just don't do it at all. But ironically, in a couple states where it was MLK Day, in 2 states specifically, Alabama, Mississippi, they celebrated General Robert E. Lee Day. All right, and if you don't know who Robert E. Lee is, that was the general that was leading the Confederate Army, and so the Southerners in the Civil War. And this is just a long history of the Southern states having days dedicated to people from important people in the Confederacy of the Civil War, which still until this day just absolutely blows my mind, because those are the bad guys. The Civil War is quite literally, the Southern traitors fighting against the United States. So how you can still honor them and then claim and turn around and be like, we're the true patriots, we care about America, still blows my mind. On one hand, you have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is probably the biggest figurehead of the civil rights era. And, I don't want to say most important person from the civil rights era, but, he's certainly on that short list of most important people of the civil rights era. and most well-known person from the civil rights era, and then a person that led an army to try and crush what Martin Luther King eventually came and stood for, because they not only didn't want black people to have civil rights, they just didn't want you to be citizens, period. They wanted you to remain a slave. It's so crazy because so black people are like 13.5% of the population, but Mississippi and Alabama are two of the blackest states in the Union, and they're celebrating Robert E. Lee on the same day that the country is celebrating Martin Luther King. And if that's not an intentional slap in the face, I don't know what is. And they're just the latest states to still do it. Most of the southern states at some point recently still had days honoring the Confederacy or Confederate leaders. And with this, to go back to the whole DEI conversation and talk about why efforts to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, do you think a state that celebrates the Confederacy is a state that probably will hire black people and, put them in positions that maybe they earned and deserve to be in when they're still honoring the legacy of people that fought for them to remain slaves? If you can just critically think for a second, you'd probably be like, yeah, I would imagine they would be getting discriminated against in a state that still honors people that wanted them to be slaves. So I feel like it's so obvious and so simple, yet people will fight against that kind of stuff. And it really just blows my mind how, we still have to have conversations like this in 2025, that anything that has to do with the Confederacy, if it's not in a museum, it should not exist. It's really that simple. You don't see any part of Germany, I can guarantee they don't have anything related to celebrating people of the Third Reich. It's not celebrated. And everything that has something to do with them is probably in a museum somewhere. And I know they do have a rise of far right people in there, but the government itself is not saying, let's have holidays in honor of people from the Third Reich. And this is what's so crazy about this. This is going into the 2020s. So in the 2020s, states like Louisiana, Virginia, in the 2010s, Georgia, Arkansas, they all finally started getting rid of some of these monuments and some of these holidays. Shocker, Alabama and Mississippi are just, they're doubling down and staying strong. And really, it's just, that's Alabama and Mississippi for you, to be honest with you. That's just the way those places are. And to wrap up this topic on how the country still obviously hates black people, or at least parts of the country still obviously hate black people, let's talk about the school shooting near Nashville, where there was a black school shooter, and all these people were finally like, gotcha, now what are you going to say? There's a black school shooter. Are you going to even talk about it? And yeah, of course I'm going to talk about it. And the craziest thing about the black school shooter is it was a black kid, that 17-year-old that killed one girl and then himself, and I think injured another. And he was a black white supremacist. He's literally Clayton Bigsby from Chappelle's Show. And in his manifesto, he talked about how he loved Hitler and how he supported all these white supremacist ideas and Candace Owens. And I will say, all these people that are like, Candace Owens, you should listen to her, blah, 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 stuff like that. She just tells it how it is. She's a real one. Well, if you got black people that are shooting up schools that are white supremacists, the black white supremacists, finally happened in real life, and then names you as one of his biggest inspirations, you should probably reevaluate how you feel about that person. If someone did some type of crazy atrocity and said I was one of their biggest inspirations, I would probably really look in the mirror and think about the stuff that I'm saying in front of a screen or in front of a microphone. But I don't know. What do I know? Maybe I'm the crazy one. Yeah, it's real. It's spooky out here. It's crazy, the kind of stuff that's going on. But ultimately, what you got to survive. You got to keep grinding. You got to keep fighting to make the world a better place. And ultimately, you got to believe that someday it will be better. Otherwise, what is all of it worth? It's worth nothing. So that's really how I at least keep my head on straight and think that I'm trying to stand up for what's good. And of course, none of us are always on the good side of an issue, but I can say that when it comes to human rights and human decency, I will always be on the right side of that. And I don't mean right politically, I mean like the good side, because I don't know, I'm not a soulless asshole. But yeah, my January has been pretty interesting personally. Of course, I'm still recovering from knee surgery. I had a uncle pass away at the end of 24, and we had his funeral, and it was bittersweet. It was nice to see a lot of my dad's family. It was my dad's baby brother, so that was hard for him. And I will say what that did for me is that just reminded me that you can't, it's like a cheesy saying, but when people say like, don't go to bed at night mad at someone, and my dad and my uncle have been kind of arguing, fighting lately, and my dad never got a chance to, I guess, in this life, make up with my uncle. And my dad, who's famously not a very emotional person, is having a really hard time dealing with that. And that just reminds me that people that you're having issues with, or whether that be family, whether that be a significant other, it's always important to try and make up for some of those things, especially when it's, if you're fighting with someone, it's, try to get that shit figured out, because you never know when the last conversation you might have with someone are. And of course, we switched gears and we're talking about this more personal stuff, and that brings me right into these questions I got asked from the last podcast that I will address, or I guess I'll answer, because it's almost Valentine's Day. So someone said, Valentine's Day is coming up. Are you single and ready to mingle? And my answer to being ready to mingle is I'm not interested, but I guess, I'm not married, I'm not engaged, I'm not in a relationship, but no, I'm not mingling, to just put that pretty simply. And then that was anonymous. This one's not, but I'm not gonna put your info out there. And he said, is it worth it having a Valentine's Day this year, or are we just gonna focus on ourselves, #Saturday? And I will say that is entirely up to you personally. I don't know why people think that I'm some good person to ask about this kind of stuff, because I'm not. I don't think I have any better advice about this stuff than anybody else. But when it comes to, I guess, relationships with another person, you know yourself better than I know you. So if you think if you desire that in your life and you want that in your life, then I'd say go for it. And if you think it's not the right time for it, then wait. But I guess if you have a person that makes you want those things, then I don't necessarily believe in the right person at the wrong time. I think the right person goes into your life at the right time. And if it is the right person, then it'll all work out. And yeah, it's really that simple. I know we got all political there in the beginning, but it is the first week of a new president. So of course things are going to be a little more political, but that part aside, really, let's try to make sure we have a good 2025, try to make 2025 better than 2024. Of course, I'm always looking for people to join me on this. So if you've got anything you want to talk about, you want to throw some ideas, let me get you on the podcast and we can shoot the shit about it. Again, make sure you drop that like, subscribe, follow at A Day with Dre. Again, I'm on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, wherever you want to find me, you will find me. YouTube as well. And yeah, let's have a great 2025. Appreciate you guys for listening. Take care.